Hey everybody, I'm Weston Corbett. I'm a major in marine science at the University of South Carolina, and today I'm going to teach you all about tides. Tides are the movement of water on Earth. They are the reason why sometimes when you're at the beach, you have to move your toys back before the water takes them away. Tides happen because of the moon's gravitational pull on the ocean. On the left is a full moon, and on the right is a new moon. These moon phases only happen once a month. During these phases, the tides are the strongest. This is because the sun and moon line up in a line, creating a very strong gravitational pull on the Earth's ocean. Right after a new or full moon, the tide is at its highest for the month. We call that a spring tide. When the tide is at its highest spring tide of the whole year, we call that a king tide. And remember, this is due to the fact that the moon and sun line up with each other and create the most gravitational pull on the Earth's ocean. We describe tides with terms like high tide and low tide. Every day or every 24 hours, there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides. The time between a high tide and a low tide is exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes. High and low tides do not happen at the same time every day. If there's a high tide at noon one day, then the next day the high tide would occur right before 1. This is because of the fact that tides change every 6 hours and 12 minutes. Those 12 minutes are what make the tides change at different times of the day. In 1687, Sir Isaac Newton, a famous European scientist, was the first to discover how the sun and moon's gravitational pull affect the Earth's ocean. He named his discovery the tidal theory. Not all areas of the world have the same tidal strength. For example, the highest tide in the world is located in Canada at the Bay of Fundy. The difference between low and high tide at the Bay of Fundy is around 52 feet, which, for reference, is about the height of a 5-story building. The Bay of Fundy is located right on the border of Nova Scotia. The Bay of Fundy has the strongest tides in the world, but near Anchorage, Alaska, there are the strongest tides in the whole United States. The difference between high and low tides here is around 40 feet. 40 feet can be represented by 2 Tyrannosaurus rexes standing on top of each other. Although it may seem like tides are just annoying and a hassle on your beach day, but they actually provide many benefits to marine animals. For example, as you can see here, these fiddler crabs, or as some people call them, ghost crabs, rely on the tides to bring their food and nutrients up onto the beach. During high tide, the ocean water rises up, and as it goes back down, the water leaves nutrients for fiddler crabs to scavenge. As you can see here, the tide has brought seaweed up onto the beach. We may think seaweed is just stinky and slimy, but marine life, such as fiddler crabs, thrive off of this seaweed by scavenging dead animal remnants and other nutrients. There are other beach animals that need this source of food to survive, like hermit crabs and seagulls. There are many other environments that are affected by tides. This is a picture of the marshlands in my hometown, Charleston. This picture is an example of the marsh during high tide, and this is an example of the marsh at low tide. These tides are important for many kinds of marine life. One of the more well-known is the redfish, or as some people call them, red drum, puppy drum, and spot-tail bass. During low tide, the redfish hunt along the oyster beds for bait fish like minnows, menhaden, and shrimp. During high tide, they travel up into the marsh reeds and eat bugs that live in the grass. Another type of tide we haven't talked about is the neap tide. A neap tide is the opposite of a spring tide. It is when the water level changes the least between tides, meaning there isn't as big of a difference between high and low tide. Neap tides are formed when the Earth, Sun, and Moon form a right angle. This causes the Sun and Moon to pull the water in 2 different directions, unlike a spring tide where they pull in the same direction. Neap tides happen during a quarter or 3/4 moons, which is when you can only see a little bit or you can see almost all of it. Animals react differently to different kinds of tides. These Christmas crabs here use neap tides to their advantage. During the wet season, these crabs live inland in the forest, but as the wet season draws to a close, they have to migrate to the beach. As the wet season ends, the moon is in the phase to create a neap tide. The Christmas crabs use this neap tide to lay their eggs in the ocean. They do this during the time because it allows their eggs a better chance at survival in the ocean. This is because without the tides changing so drastically, they have a better chance at surviving and being able to break out of their eggs. Tides are not all good though. Some things they cause are beach erosion, and sometimes they can cause riptides. Tides can contribute to beach erosion during hurricanes. If the dunes on the beach are broken through by the incoming tide and hurricane swell, then it is likely that all the houses behind will become flooded and ruined. Some beaches suffer such bad erosion from the tides that they have to do something called renourishment. Renourishment is a process of bringing sand from the ocean up onto the shore to rebuild the dunes and the barricades protecting the beachfront houses. Erosion from tides can also happen underwater. For example, tides can create riptides, which is a break in the sandbar underwater. Riptides, or some people call them rip currents, are extremely dangerous, and you should use caution if you ever see one. These riptides are one of the bad things that are derived from tides. Although, in reality, waves are the primary cause of erosion, strong incoming tides are what make these waves so lethal to our beaches and homes. When I say incoming tide, I mean the time between low tide and high tide. That is when the water is coming from its lowest to its highest. An outgoing tide is the opposite. That is when tide is going from high to low, so the water is going back out to the ocean instead of onto the shore. Although most beaches and coasts have 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day, there are some anomalies. In this picture here, this beach is called Tahiti. Tahiti only has 1 tide a day. In other parts of the world, like Ireland, there are 6 tides a day. There are also disappearing tides, double high tides, and double low tides. There are many different tide anomalies around the world. Although tides are dangerous because they cause erosion to our beaches and coastline, they have many positive effects as well, such as creating creeks and inlets for shellfish and other marine life to live. And this is good because fishermen use these creeks and inlets to fish for fish and collect shellfish to later on sell them to restaurants. Now remember, high tides occur twice a day and low tides occur twice a day. The time between a low tide and a high tide is 6 hours and 12 minutes. A spring tide occurs during a new moon or a full moon, and this is when the tides have the largest difference in water level. The highest spring tide of a year for a certain beach or coastline is called the king tide. When the moon phase is a quarter or a 3/4 moon, that is when a neap tide occurs. A neap tide is the opposite of a spring tide. It is when there is the least water level difference between low tide and high tide. Spring tides occur twice a month, and neap tides also occur twice a month. Also, remember that the greatest factor in tide movement is the gravitational pull of the moon. Although, the sun also affects it, and that is why we have neap tides and we have extra strong spring tides. Although tides can be annoying with how they wash away our toys or bring stinky, slimy seaweed onto the beach, they are extremely important in our everyday lives on every aspect. And that is why I believe it is so important to truly understand and study the different types of tides and how they affect our world. Thank you for taking interest in my video on tides. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I hope you enjoyed.